When my father died, I believed the hardest moment of my life had already arrived and passed. Standing in the quiet of a cemetery just outside Columbus, Ohio, I watched the casket of a man named Robert Hayes slowly disappear beneath fresh earth. He had spent 40 years working long hours as a contractor, building homes for other families while making sure his own always felt safe. To most people, he was the dependable man who showed up early, worked late, and never complained. To me, he was simply Dad. That afternoon, the sky hung low and gray, and every person who came to shake my hand spoke the same soft sentence. They all said he was a good man. I nodded every time, believing that the worst pain I would ever feel had already arrived in that moment. But grief has a strange way of hiding what is coming next. Because standing only a few feet away from me that day, holding a tissue to her eyes and leaning against friends for comfort, was my stepmother, Linda. She had married my father 4 years earlier. At the funeral, she looked devastated, almost fragile, like someone who had lost the center of her world. Yet what I didn't know then was that while the rest of us were mourning, Linda was already making quiet decisions that would change everything about my life. 3 weeks later, I drove down Maple Ridge Drive toward the house where I had grown up. The same white house my father built himself 30 years earlier, the one where every Christmas morning and every birthday dinner had taken place. I pulled into the driveway expecting silence and sadness, maybe even the awkward conversation families have when they are still trying to figure out how life continues after someone is gone. Instead, I noticed something strange before I even stepped out of the car. The front door lock had been replaced. At first, I assumed it was a mistake, maybe a repair, maybe something Linda had done after the funeral for security. But when I tried my key and it would not turn, the truth landed all at once. The home I had walked into thousands of times suddenly belonged to someone else. I knocked on the door and waited. After a moment, Linda opened it halfway, just enough to look out. Her expression was calm, almost rehearsed, and the words she said next would stay with me for years. She told me my father's will had been finalized and that the house was now legally hers. Then she said something even harder to understand. She told me it would be better if I found somewhere else to stay. Within 3 weeks of burying my father, I had been locked out of my own childhood home. At first, I assumed it was grief speaking, that maybe Linda was overwhelmed and making decisions too quickly. But the days that followed made it clear something else was happening. Phone calls were ignored. Messages went unanswered. Boxes containing my old belongings appeared on the front porch like items left behind after a yard sale. Inside those boxes were childhood photos, baseball trophies, and letters my father had written to me years earlier while I was away at college. Every memory had been packed up neatly, as if someone had already decided they no longer belonged in the house. Friends and relatives were confused when I told them what had happened. They remembered my father as a man who always insisted that family came first. The idea that he would leave everything to Linda while pushing his own son away did not make sense to anyone who knew him well. But paperwork can change stories quickly. According to the will Linda showed people, my father had left the house, his savings, and even his small construction business entirely to her. On paper, it looked clear. The problem was that something deep inside me kept saying my father would never have made that choice. Before we go deeper into the story, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We always enjoy seeing how many different places these stories reach. And if you find yourself interested in real stories like this one, do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what happened after that locked door would lead to questions about money, loyalty, and a secret my father had been keeping during the final months of his life. At the time, I still believed this story was about a disagreement over a will. I thought it was about grief turning people against each other, something that sadly happens in many families after a death. What I did not realize was that my father had already seen signs that something around him was wrong. And before he passed away, he had taken one quiet step that my stepmother never expected. To understand how everything began, you have to go back several years before my father died. My dad, Robert Hayes, was the type of man people respected without him ever asking for it. He grew up in a small town in Ohio and learned the value of hard work early in life. By the time he was 30, he had started his own construction company. Nothing huge, just a small crew that built houses and renovated properties around the county. But the work was steady and over the years it built a comfortable life for our family. My mother passed away when I was in my early 20s, and for a long time my father lived alone in the house he built for them both. Friends worried about him during those years because he had always been a family man. Eventually, after nearly a decade by himself, he met Linda at a local community fundraiser. She was friendly, confident, and about 15 years younger than him. At first, most of us were simply glad he had found companionship again. He laughed more when she was around. He traveled a little, something he had rarely done before. For a while, it looked like life had given him a second chance at happiness. But small changes started appearing after the wedding. Linda gradually became involved in everything my father did. She helped manage the business accounts, organize bills, and insisted she could handle paperwork that my father used to manage himself. At first, that seemed helpful. My father had never enjoyed dealing with documents or banking details. Yet over time, some family members noticed that Linda was always the one answering questions about finances. When relatives asked about my dad's projects or investments, she spoke for him before he had a chance. My father did not seem bothered by it. If anything, he appeared relieved to let someone else take control of the details. Still, something about the shift made a few people uneasy. My aunt once joked that Linda ran the house like a company boardroom, always organized and always in charge. We laughed about it then, never imagining how important that control would eventually become. About a year before my father died, I started noticing changes in him that were harder to explain. He seemed tired more often, forgetting small things that had never slipped his mind before. Sometimes when I visited the house, he looked distracted, like a man trying to remember where he had placed something important. Linda always explained it away as stress. She said running the construction company had worn him down and that he needed rest. She often mentioned new medications his doctor had prescribed for blood pressure and anxiety. I accepted those explanations because they sounded reasonable. Many men my father's age deal with health issues as they get older. But looking back now, there were moments that felt different. Moments when my father tried to say something privately and then stopped himself when Linda entered the room. Moments when he looked like he wanted to ask for help but could not quite put the words together. One evening, about 6 months before he died, my father asked me to meet him for coffee at a diner near the highway. It was unusual because he normally preferred to talk at home. When I arrived, he seemed nervous, tapping his fingers against the table while he waited for the waitress to leave. He asked me how work was going, how my apartment search was progressing, all the normal questions a father asks his son. But there was something heavy behind his words, like he was working his way toward a topic he had not decided how to explain. Eventually, he leaned forward and said something that stuck with me long after the conversation ended. He told me that sometimes people change when money becomes involved. I remember laughing at the time, assuming he was talking about business partners or clients who had disappointed him. I told him he had always been good at spotting those kinds of problems. He nodded but did not say much else after that. We finished our coffee and went our separate ways. I did not know then that it would be one of the last long conversations we ever had. During the months that followed, my father's health continued to decline. Linda handled most of the communication with doctors and pharmacies. When I offered to help, she politely told me everything was under control. She said my father needed peace and that too many people worrying about him would only create more stress. I believed her. Families often rely on the closest person to coordinate care, and as his wife, she naturally took that role. Then one night I received a call from Linda telling me my father had been taken to the hospital after feeling dizzy and collapsing in the living room. By the time I arrived, he was already resting in a hospital bed, surrounded by machines that beeped quietly in the background. Linda explained that doctors believed his heart had simply given out under years of stress. Within 24 hours, my father was gone. The official report described it as natural causes. No investigation followed, and life moved forward as it does after any sudden loss. The funeral passed in a blur of handshakes and quiet conversations. People spoke about my father's kindness and his work ethic. Linda cried openly, often leaning on friends for support. I remember feeling sorry for her in those moments because losing a spouse is a painful experience for anyone. Yet just days after the funeral, practical matters began moving quickly. Linda contacted lawyers about the estate, explaining that my father had updated his will not long before he passed away. I assumed the document would simply divide his assets between us in some fair way. That expectation disappeared the day she showed me the paperwork. According to the document, nearly everything my father owned now belonged to her. The house, the savings accounts, the company vehicles, and the construction business itself were all listed under her control. My name appeared only once, attached to a small amount of money that looked more like a polite gesture than a meaningful inheritance. At first, I tried to accept it because arguing with legal documents felt pointless. But the more I thought about it, the less it matched the father I knew. He had always spoken about making sure the house stayed in the family. He had talked about passing the construction business down someday, even if I never wanted to run it full time. The sudden shift in his final wishes seemed out of place. Friends who had known him for decades expressed the same confusion. One evening, a longtime employee from my father's company called me privately. His name was Mark Sullivan, a man who had worked with my dad for nearly 20 years. Mark told me something I had not heard before. He said my father had mentioned concerns about paperwork a few months earlier. According to Mark, my dad had joked that he needed to double-check everything because mistakes could happen when too many hands handled the documents. At the time, Mark thought it was just casual conversation. But hearing that comment after the will appeared made it feel different. Weeks passed while Linda began selling parts of the business and transferring funds from accounts I had never even heard about. The speed of those decisions raised more questions. My father had spent decades building the company carefully, yet suddenly everything was being liquidated like someone trying to close a chapter as quickly as possible. Around that time, I visited an attorney recommended by a friend. I brought copies of the will Linda had shown me and asked if anything looked unusual. The lawyer studied the pages quietly before pointing out something subtle but important. He said the signature on the final page appeared slightly inconsistent with the other examples of my father's handwriting. It was not proof of anything, but it was enough to raise curiosity. That single observation changed the direction of the entire story, because if the signature truly was different, it meant the document controlling my father's entire estate might not be what it appeared to be. The search for answers led me back to the house where everything began. Linda still refused to let me inside, but a neighbor eventually handed me a small box she said had been left in the garage after the funeral. She assumed it belonged to me and had simply been forgotten. Inside the box were old receipts, a few photographs, and an envelope with my father's handwriting across the front. The message was simple and direct. It said, "If anything happens to me, open this." My hands shook as I unfolded the paper inside. What I read over the next few minutes changed my understanding of the last year of my father's life. In that letter, he explained that he had grown concerned about the way financial decisions were being handled around him. He wrote that sometimes he felt pressured to sign documents quickly, without the chance to review them carefully. Because of those concerns, he had taken a step to protect the things he spent his life building. The final lines of the letter revealed the secret my stepmother never expected. My father had quietly created another will months earlier and placed it with a separate attorney outside the county. That document, written long before the one Linda presented, told a very different story about how he wanted his property and business handled after his death. Instead of leaving everything to one person, it divided assets between family members and secured the future of the company for employees who had worked beside him for years. Armed with that letter, I contacted the attorney mentioned in the note. What followed was a legal battle that lasted nearly a year. Experts compared signatures, reviewed bank transfers, and listened to testimony from people who had watched events unfold during my father's final months. In the end, the court ruled that the document Linda presented could not be trusted as the final word on my father's wishes. When the ruling was announced, the quiet confidence Linda had carried for months disappeared. The assets she believed were secured under her control were redistributed according to the earlier will my father had prepared. The house returned to the family line he had always talked about protecting. The business was preserved under an arrangement that kept longtime employees involved. As for Linda, she left the courthouse without the life she had expected to inherit. Looking back now, the moment that still stays with me is not the courtroom decision or the financial outcome. It is the memory of that small letter hidden inside a box in the garage. My father had sensed that something was wrong long before the rest of us noticed. And with one quiet decision, he ensured that the truth would eventually find its way back into the light. The real lesson of this story is simple. Sometimes the people who appear closest to us are the ones we understand the least. And sometimes the person we believe we have lost still manages to protect us in ways we never imagined possible.